4 years ago, Evanston, Illinois announced they were going to spend $10 million over 10 years to black residents there. The program would provide upwards of $25,000 housing grants for down payments, repairs, or existing mortgages to atone for the city's past racial policies. Joining us right now is Rue Simmons. She's the founder and executive director of To Repair from Evanston. So, Robin, this is now started.
Absolutely. Thank you, Roland, for having me. The program or the commitment to reparations has actually been implemented. Disbursements has happened. I want to add that in 2019, we did commit to seeding the work with $10 million initially from our recreational cannabis sales tax. And since then, we've added an additional $10 million from real estate transfer tax and are looking for additional revenue streams, as well as additional forms of repair, different remedies to implement. But to date, we have begun dispersing the $25,000 direct benefits to build wealth through home equity, as well as recently expanding our program to include cash benefits as an option. So over the last month that this has been an option, we have had more of our recipients select a cash benefit for their reparations.
What has been the response of residents? Do you have folks, granted the city council passed this, do you have folks who are opposing this, who still find this to be a bad idea with taxpayer funds?
Well, I'll say we have broad support in the city. The initial legislation passed in 2019 with an 8-to-1 vote. Future votes have passed either unanimously or 8-to-1. And you're never going to have 100% support. So we have some residents that early on felt very strongly that only cash is an appropriate form of repair. We have made that adjustment. And we have few that have spoken publicly about their disagreement to advance reparations with taxpayer dollars. But we do know that thought is out there. Overwhelmingly, we have support in our city from the ally community, of course, from the Black community to advance reparations. There is more question about forms of repair, urgency, amount, and so on. So we continue to work through the complicated process to implement reparations in Evanston.
What do you make of folks like Sandy Darity, who claims that what you're doing there in Evanston, it's not reparations, you should not be calling it that?
Well, Sandy has an opinion about local reparations. And so it's not just Evanston specifically, but localities that are advancing reparations. I understand he's in disagreement with that only a federal legislation for reparations is appropriate. And it is important to note that in Evanston, as well as now over 100 cities that are advancing a local reparations initiatives and even more states, that all of us share the North Star of a federal policy as a necessity for us to get to the full repair, get anywhere close to that number, because localities do not have the capacity to address the harms in Black communities. And we recognize that. So it's pretty much a false debate that local reparations is not reparations. In fact, it is reparations. It is a specific remedy in correlation to a direct harm to the Black community. It is not satisfying the reparations that we demand for the crimes of the transatlantic slave trade and other policy. But it is, in fact, reparations at a local level. It's going to be very different from city to city based on city history, capacity, and the ability to disperse and repair.
Well, to your point, there was an Anscape article that was done, and this is what was actually discussed, and the question was asked, and he said, I think they created this. He says, I think they create an obstacle to a federal program because they are insufficient for meeting what we view as a primary goal of a reparations plan, which is to eliminate the racial wealth gap. And it says we estimate a conservative amount that would be required for Evanston to close the wealth gap for its Black residents will be at least $3 billion. The city's annual budget is about $360 million. They have a peculiar plan, which is really what we call a housing voucher plan, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so here's a perfect example that, to me, again, so Evanston makes this decision. And even he says that the city's annual budget is $360 million. But he's come up with $3 billion. Okay, the money got to come from somewhere.
Right.
And so if you have an annual budget of $360 million, and you're saying, well, we think it's going to take $3 billion, that means your budget, you're not going to even generate $3 billion for at least 10 years.
Right.
So,
right, for an entire budget.
So how in the world, so what? Does the city of Evanston go somewhere to borrow the $3 billion to give the black folks? And I would think that if you have multiple programs in different cities, that's creating momentum for what you want on the federal level, because right now, ain't no federal program.
That's right. That's right. So here's a couple things. One is that it's only the racial wealth gap that addresses repair. And so we do this work now full time in communities across the nation. Dozens I've been in personally. Black communities are not just looking at a cash benefit only, they're looking at full repair, a comprehensive approach to repair, which includes access to housing, business, education, health, police reform, clean air, and so on. We're looking for full repair under the 5 components of reparations. So first of all. Secondly, it is not only localities that are responsible for the harm. The conversation of reparations in contemporary history, in 1989, Rep. John Conyers introduced H.R. 40. It's languished in Congress. But that doesn't mean that localities don't take a first tangible step in doing what they can do what is possible. And we have seen, as you have just stated, Roland, that momentum has happened. In 2019, it was only Evanston. Today, there are over 100 cities. In 2019, it was only 65 co-sponsors in the House for H.R. 40. And the last Congress ended with 219 co-sponsors and yes votes for H.R. 40, a Senate companion bill, hundreds of allies organizations that support reparations, and more momentum. The movement is being professionalized by foundations that are providing resources, funding, and other technical assistance so that we can get to liberation and repair in the Black community. So again, I just simply think it's a false debate to say that local reparations is not reparations. I do agree that local reparations alone is insufficient. And that's why I am encouraged to see that it's not just states or municipalities, it's now states. Look at the great work that's happening in California, the great work that's been introduced in the state of New York and Massachusetts. We see counties beginning to have the conversation on reparations, more and more institutions and industries. The academy has joined the case for reparations. And so like any other important public policy, federal public policy, when you think about school desegregation and fair housing and marriage equality and ban the box and even cannabis now being a federal conversation, it starts with a local spark, a grassroots leader, a municipal law, a state action, and then we get to a federal policy. And so I'm just encouraged and stand with all the other local leaders, stand with those that are working on local initiatives, that we are making progress. And in Evanston, we are dispersing reparations.
Michael.
Hey, Robin. Good to see you again.
Hey, how
Congratulations.
are you?
I'm all right.
Thank you.
Congratulations on the documentary. For those that don't know, I interviewed Robin 2 years ago on the African History Network show. So it's great that this is paying out. I know there's a lot of hard work. Hey, when we talked, one of the things we talked about is how Evanston, Illinois did not have a history of slavery. And there were so many reparations reactionaries out here attacking what you were doing and what the city council was doing. Can you talk some about that, why you chose the housing vouchers as opposed to quote unquote reparations for slavery? And then also there was a 70-page study that was produced that preceded the recommendations, the policies that you all did. Talk about why was that 70-page study? Because you have so many hashtag cut the check people out here saying we don't need a study, just cut the check. Can you address that, please?
Absolutely. So first of all, it's important to know that one of the most important practices of reparations is that the harmed community, the Black community, is really prescribing what redress looks like. And it's important to know that the Evanston Black community went through a process in 2019 where we heard and by consensus move forward with prioritizing housing. Now, as you mentioned, that report complemented the demand from the community. The report was done by Shorefront Legacy Center, led by Dino Robinson and his colleagues, and it showed anti-Black housing practices, zoning laws, housing policy that is responsible for stripping away wealth and opportunity in Black Evanston and is responsible for our current racial segregation today. I live in the west end of the Fifth Ward. I served as councilwoman here for 4 years. It's still the most concentrated Black community, also most concentrated disinvestment in everything, least community amenities, no neighborhood school, no walkable access to healthy foods, air quality issues, deteriorating housing stocks. The list goes on, and our story in Evanston is like every other city in America, and that's why local reparations. But thirdly, it's important to know that this is not a slavery reparations. This is not to compete with the demands for HR 40. This is specific to the business and anti-Blackness of Evanston. And our legal counsel, our corporation counsel, Nick Cummings, and his supporters and his partners, including Professor Justin Hansford from Thurgood Marshall School at Howard Law School, came up with a legal framework, one that was viable, so that we could move past just the demand and the case for reparation, which we've been stuck in for so long, and get into implementation and disbursement. And so that legal framework was really key in us having a strong case, one that was withstand legal challenges, which we've had from conservative groups from outside of Evanston, from Texas and DC. They have tried to challenge our work, but our work is very thoughtful, it's very smart, it's careful, it's narrowly tailored. It includes a home rule municipality. We're using home rule taxes, so we're not using federal dollars that are being passed down and have to deal with blocks from other courts outside of Evanston. We are leading within our values. It is possible for other localities to do the same, and that's how we got to housing. In a long story, that's how we got to housing. The community informed it and prescribed it. The case for reparations was rooted in housing, and the legal framework supported a remedy in direct correlation to the harm, which in the case of Evanston is largely based on housing.
All right, thank you.
Matt?
Yeah, so Robin, thanks for joining us this evening. I think this is a brilliant program, and I'm really glad to hear Justin Hansford from Howard Law School was involved, and I'm not surprised at the brilliance of this program. But I did have two questions, and the first is, how did y'all decide on how to determine when harm ended for eligibility purposes? I saw it was between 1919 and 1969, but obviously there are a lot of pervasive effects that continue on to today. So how did you decide to cordon that off? And how does the eligibility work as it relates to descendants of people who experienced that, number one? And the second question was, I think it's genius that it's tied to the recreational marijuana taxation that the city does, right? So what has been the buy-in, if any, from cannabis groups across the country as it relates to that, and that potentially being used as a vehicle to fund other reparations programs? Because there's obviously a justice component with that in terms of how many people over the years were convicted of something that's now legal. So if you would you address those two issues, please?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So first, in terms of eligibility, we looked at the harm. It was very specific and measurable. It was a zoning law that was enforced and implemented between 1919 and 1969. It was implemented until fair housing was passed federally. So we are looking at everybody Black in Evanston that lived here between 1919 and 1969 had a direct harm, and their descendants were harmed as a result of the direct harm of their elders and ancestors. And so that's how we framed our eligibility. We didn't look at neighborhood or census tract. We didn't look at lineage. In fact, in Evanston, I can speak for Evanston. I know that there is a very passionate lineage conversation across the nation, but In our case, during our period of harm, the whole diaspora was here. We're a very diverse Black community. One of our biggest reparations leaders is a Haitian immigrant. So we have a harm that is defined in that period of 50 years, and direct descendants are eligible. And right now we have started with prioritizing the elders, who in the program language are classified as ancestors. So those that had direct harm at the point of disbursement, those were about 70 years old and older, receive their reparations benefit first. First of all, because they experienced the direct harm, and secondly, because we want to make sure we get to repair as soon as possible for those that may transition. And unfortunately, we've had some of our reparations eligible community members transition during this time. To address that, we have allowed all of the applicants to name a beneficiary in the event they transition before their reparations benefit is dispersed. In the event that they didn't do that, and we've had about a handful of cases where they didn't name a beneficiary, then that benefit goes to the estate. And either the estate has decided who is a beneficiary, or that will happen through some form of probate court. But this is a benefit that belongs to the estate, the family, and it is intended to build generational wealth for families. And so that explains our eligibility. We had 640 applications come in on our first round of the application being open. 140 of them classified or qualified under that ancestor, or they were the elders that had direct harm, and the balance of them are, like myself, descendants. And then as it relates to your question regarding cannabis sales tax and revenue, absolutely. The cannabis law, even written in Illinois, had language about reparative justice and even reparations, but it was more so as it relates to dispensaries and the business of cannabis, the industry of cannabis. And we thought it important in Evanston that we also look at those revenues, that wealth that's being generated from an industry that has harmed our community. In Evanston, 71% of the marijuana arrests were in the Black community, and we are only about 15% of the population. So there was a clear issue of harm as it relates to over-policing and cannabis in Evanston. Mm-hmm. We had 100% consensus that we do use the cannabis sales tax to initiate our reparations.
Thank you.
All right. Robin, we certainly appreciate it. Thanks so very much for breaking it all down for us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.